Hi, everyone. Welcome to our first ever live webcast. I'm Clinton Begley. I'm the Executive Director for the Long Tom Watershed Council. And welcome. This is going to be really fun. I realize you might be joining us from just about anywhere, but I wish to acknowledge that the Long Tom Watershed does lie within the traditional homelands of the tribes and bands of the Kalapuyan peoples. Following treaties in the 1850s, the Kalapuya people were dispossessed and forcibly removed from their indigenous homeland by the United States government. Today, many of the descendants are citizens of Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde and Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians. We acknowledge that we are on occupied lands and express our respect to the Kalapuya and all the tribal nations of Oregon and the important contributions they continue to make to our communities, including to the stewardship of this watershed. As I mentioned, this is our first ever live webcast and our first public meeting in a while. It's been a while since we've seen a lot of you in the watershed, and some of us have more hair on our heads and faces than probably the last time we saw you. I can also guarantee that we are a little bit rusty, so we might have some awkwardness. There might be some technical difficulties, but we're really excited to be reconnected with you again, and appreciate your grace as we sort of figure out those things along the way together. So tonight will be a 1-hour program on the Streaked Horned Lark and the habitats that the Long Tom and partners have been restoring for these birds and other native species for about a year now. We have some amazing speakers, and I'm going to turn it over to Rob, who can give a little introduction on who's going to be talking with you tonight. Rob?
Thanks, Clinton. Hi, everybody. I'm Rob Hoshaw, and thanks for tuning in. Before we begin, I wanted to just briefly mention if you have questions, you're welcome to put those in the comments section of YouTube, and we'll have a few minutes after each speaker to answer those. Our first presenter is the multi-talented Amanda Reinholtz. She works on an array of projects for LTWC as our habitat and water quality specialist, and she has a background in remote sensing, graphic information systems, and geomorphology. She leads our Ludwigia weed removal program and the data collection efforts for our pesticide and temperature monitoring programs. And among many other things, she also happens to be a whiz at creating maps in GIS. She recently used that skill set to create an online interactive story map of the Coyote Creek South project, which you may have seen referenced in our April newsletter. So now Amanda is going to walk through some of the highlights of that story map, particularly those maps and graphics that help tell the story of the Streaked Horned Lark restoration there. So Amanda, go ahead and share your screen and take it away.
All right, hello. Let me get sorted here for a second. All right. Thank you very much, Rob. As Rob said, my name is Amanda, and I am very excited to be a part of our first virtual public meeting. This is also my first time being live on YouTube, so it's a momentous event in my personal life as well. I have kind of two objectives this evening, and one is to introduce you to a great restoration project the council has been involved with over the past 5 years or so, Coyote Creek South, especially as it pertains to Streaked Horned Lark. So in that respect, I'm kind of be the opener for Bob, who's going to be talking more about lark and showing you a lot of really great lark pictures to come. And my other goal is to introduce you to this story map that I had the great pleasure of helping to create. And it's kind of a behemoth of a thing. There's a whole lot of information in it. So I'm going to be using it as my slide set and kind of jumping around using tabs to try to avoid making you all feel too dizzy with scrolling. But know that it's a resource that's out there for you. You can actually find it just by Googling Coyote Creek South story map, or you can find it on our website. And I hope that if you see anything that interests you, you'll come back and check it out at a later time. So the first thing that I want to do when talking about this project is acknowledge the relatively small role I've played in it. There have been so many great people involved in this project. We've had funding from the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board. The Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife is the landowner in the project site. And Chris Vogel, the project manager, has done so much of the planning and project management effort. Internally here at the Long Tom Watershed Council, Katie McKendrick has been a huge force in making this project happen and seeing it through. And Abby Kohlauer is now involved helping manage the project. Both of them are currently involved in expanding the project to neighboring properties in coordination with ODFW. You can see here, we've got a nice long list of folks who have done great work, including Bob Altman, who you'll be hearing from soon. We've had Chris Pearl doing amphibian monitoring, Diane Steep with the city of Eugene. List kind of goes on and on, but I really wanted to emphasize the number of partners that we've had and the number of really good people who have contributed to this. So without further ado, I can actually talk about the project itself a little bit. You may have heard this project called a wet prairie restoration project, Coyote Creek South wet prairie restoration. And it's a restoration project really in the true sense of the word restoration, because this was a ryegrass field that had been ditched, had constructed ditches through the site, as you know, happens with many ag sites, to help drain water from the site faster in the spring and increase agricultural production. The site was leveled and was obviously converted away from the native vegetation community to the agricultural crop. And so basically we set out to undo most of those changes and bring back the wet prairie and the upland prairie communities that existed prior to agricultural development. And if that sounds like a lot of work, well, it is a lot of work. So to help justify why we spent all that effort, I want to show you a couple images and maps. The first of which is something that if you've seen any of these presentations before about oak and prairie habitats, you may have seen this image in another presentation. But these maps show the extent of different focal habitat types from the Oregon Conservation Strategy in the Willamette Valley from the 1850s, the left image, to basically present day, to about 2004. This includes some non-prairie habitat as well, some riparian habitat. But the really striking thing in this image is just how little of each habitat type is left. And wet prairie is kind of the rarest of the rare. 99% of Willamette Valley's wet prairies are now gone. 1% of the original habitat remains. And I'll also just jump into this map that's included in the story map, mostly just to show you that it's here. It's a pretty neat map that for anyone interested, I recommend taking some time to explore. This also shows the approximate, best of our knowledge, 1850s plant community throughout the Willamette Valley. So you can click around and bring up descriptions of what was on the landscape before a lot of the European settlement, a lot of the changes associated with European settlement. And this black outline here is Coyote Creek South. So you can see that Coyote Creek South was seasonally wet prairie in 1850, and that there was quite a lot of it in 1850, and a lot of it is now no longer here. So the habitat is very rare and also very important. There are a number of species that are local, endemic, native to the Willamette Valley that rely partly or solely on wet and upland prairie habitats. And many of those species are rare or threatened, or maybe even locally extirpated. The Streaked Horned Lark that Bob will be talking a lot about here in a few minutes is a threatened species that relies in part on some of these habitat types. And the Streaked Horned Lark was one of the focal species of this project. We designed all the project components thinking among other species of Streaked Horned Lark. So you'll be hearing a little more about them throughout the presentation. So you might be wondering, or you might not, you might already know the answer, why these habitats are so rare. And part of the answer is the familiar culprits of urban and agricultural development. So cities and ag lands displacing native habitats. there's also all the hydrologic modifications that come with that kind of development. So dredging and filling to create uplands on which to plant crops and build cities, the ditching in ag lands to help drain water away from agricultural sites earlier in the spring. There have also been really widespread agricultural changes or hydrological changes associated with channelizing streams and rivers, damming streams and rivers to keep them from wandering back and forth across the landscape. And that prevented large-scale disturbances that floods and channel migrations caused. And those floods and channel migrations were major factors in creating and maintaining wet prairie and upland prairie habitats. And just like European settlement forcibly eliminated a lot of the wandering and flooding that rivers and streams were doing in the area, there was also a forcible termination of the cultural practice of burning throughout the valley. The Kalapuya people, who have lived here for over 10,000 years, set regular fires across the valley, and that low frequency or high frequency, low intensity burning helped create and maintain a lot of the open prairie and savanna habitats that were so important to both the people and the plants and animals throughout the valley. So really, really important habitats to everyone in our watershed community, people, animals, and very rare, which to us makes a pretty good case for trying to restore some of these habitat values where they've been lost strategically in the right places. So now's probably a good time to show you a map of where this project is. The project location here is highlighted, it's this bright green. You can see nearby, it's nestled into a lot of other green space. So this is the Fern Ridge Wildlife Management Area that hopefully you can see my cursor all around Fern Ridge Lake. This is the West Eugene wetlands. Together they make up about 8,500 acres of conservation lands. I should probably back up a little actually and say that here's Eugene and Springfield on the east side of the map, Veneta on the left. So the project site is south of Fern Ridge Lake. And if we zoom in on it a little bit, I'd like to highlight some of the neighbors of this project. I'll be focusing on this approximately 100 acres that is actually the northernmost part of about a 300-acre property. And surrounding it are some other Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife owned properties with similar restoration either happening or slated to happen in the near future. A few properties that are in the process of coming into conservation and will hopefully appear on this map soon. And I'd also like to highlight next door, the City of Eugene's Coyote Prairie, where a lot of really great work in establishing best practices for prairie restoration has been done. And I think Bob will probably reference Coyote Prairie, talking about some of the work that they've done to benefit larks and kind of inventive work that contrasts with the way that we designed our project at Coyote Creek South. So what did we do? I had mentioned that we had kind of two overarching goals of the project: to restore wet prairie hydrology and to restore wet prairie plant community. And those were associated with kind of two major visible project actions of earth moving to fill in some of the ditches that were draining water from the site, to sculpt out some subtle berms and pools to create seasonal pools that would hold water on the site longer. And I want to show you really, I want to quickly show the machine that did a lot of that work. This is a belly scraper, and it's here creating a berm that you see across kind of this foreground of the image. You can see the borrow area, the future vernal pool here in the background. And notable is that there's a lot of disturbed ground. There's a lot of dirt involved in this restoration project that was very attractive to Lark at the start of the project. The other major restoration action, both these occurring in 2017, the earthwork in the summer, the second action, the seeding across the entire site, occurring in the fall. We seeded I think about 60-ish native species across the 110-ish acres. And all of this, of course, involved multiple years of careful site preparation and planning. I want to highlight what the site preparation for the seeding looked like a little bit. So in order to help native species get established, we had to eliminate the agricultural crop that had been growing, as well as some of the seed bank and the established invasive species as best we could, so that the native species that we were seeding would have the best chance of thriving on site. So this is the project site when most of the ryegrass is gone and dead, and before the earth moving and seeding. And you can see, again, it's pretty bare. It's pretty big disturbance to the site. And I think Bob will probably talk about that a little more and how attractive that was to lark. This is just a fun image of some of the planning that went into the berms and the pools. A really wacky LiDAR image. You can also see that monitoring is taking place before and after these major project actions. We are tracking outcomes in hydrology and vegetation, birds, which Bob will spend more time talking about, and amphibians, both before and after the project. And I don't want to talk too much about lark because that's what Bob is here to do, and he's going to do a much better job of it than I ever could. So instead, I just want to give you a couple quick facts that I think are going to be important for the next 2 minutes of your time. One is that streaked horned lark are very rare. There are only about 1,500 individuals, that might be an old estimate, left anywhere, and about 80% of them are in the Willamette Valley. And the second fact is that streaked horned lark require a lot of open space and a lot of bare or sparsely vegetated ground to nest and to survive. So we were trying to keep that requirement for bare ground or sparsely vegetated ground in mind in everything we did with this project. In terms of hydrology and our vernal pool design, we were trying to use vernal pools as a mechanism for maintaining large areas of bare ground. So we're trying to design vernal pools or seasonal pools in the center of the site that would be broad and relatively shallow and would dry pretty quickly in the spring and hopefully reveal, as they dried, barer, sparser ground than the surrounding areas, hopefully timed with when lark would require that ground to nest. And so you can see the actual monitored results of our vernal pools. I don't have much time to go into the hydrology monitoring, but again, this is online, so you're welcome to check out staff gauge readings and pool extents later in your own time if you would like. But I do want to quickly highlight at least one quick monitoring result, and that is this is the total area inundated on the site through the spring. And what's notable is that most of the water on the site dried pretty early in the spring. So most of the water stored in vernal pools was gone by the beginning of May, which is what we were hoping for. And the remaining water was mostly in these deeper pools around the margins of the site that were more designed for other purposes like amphibian habitat. So promising in terms of using hydrology for the benefit of lark. In seeding, likewise, we were focused on maintaining as much sparsely vegetated bare ground in the center of the site as possible. So again, a complicated map that I don't have time to explore in great detail, but wanted you to know was here. I'm going to draw your attention to this sad SpongeBob figure in the center of the site. And if we explore these seed mixes here at the very center of the site, you can see a species list for each mix, and you can see a photo of what that mix looked like on the ground a couple years after seeding. You'll see the sparse prairie mix is establishing with bare ground in between plants, also the vernal pool mix, plenty of bare ground. Very quickly, I wanted to highlight that our monitoring of vegetation, the second growing season after planting, revealed that overall, a lot of our native vegetation was coming in pretty nicely, but most importantly for lark, about 10% of the site overall remained unvegetated the second growing season. And that was over the entire site. So locally, that number was much higher, in like the center of the site, for instance. So more good news for lark. I won't talk much longer. I think I've already taken more time than I was supposed to, but I do want to invite all of you to look more at this story map. There's obviously a whole lot in it that I didn't go over. There's a map that you can use to take a quick virtual tour around the site if you can't make it out there yourself. There's lots of extra resources, including some fact sheets that we've created in here as well. So do check it out when you've got some time. And with that, I think we should open it up to some questions.
Thanks, Amanda. The story map is such a really cool resource for the community to engage with this kind of project. So we have a couple minutes for a few questions, and let's see. So does the Watershed Council have any burning planned on the site?
That's a wonderful question. There is burning being planned as part of the grant development that Katie and Abby are working on that I referenced. But part of that grant is developing the plan for burning. So yes, I guess the short answer is yes, hopefully there will be fire reintroduced to the site.
Nice. And you mentioned larks and other grassland birds, of course, and amphibians. Are there any other common types of wildlife species that frequent Coyote Creek South?
Yeah, there are all kinds of, there's a lot of seasonal use by birds, by elk, by raccoons. I think there's some cool pictures from the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. Motion capture cameras included in the story map. So yeah, there's a whole range of species that use the site beyond just the rare birds and amphibians, but they weren't the focus of our restoration design to the degree that we focused on native amphibians and lark.
Mm-hmm. And what about going out and visiting the site? It's owned by ODFW, so is it open for the public to go visit?
It is. The site has been closed to use. I think you can check the status of the interior site on the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife webpage, which I encourage you to do. But the site is open to the public overall after the closure for plant establishment, which I'm actually not entirely sure if that has ended or not. But regardless, the site is right on Cantrell Road, and there's a lot of bird watching and wildlife watching that you can do just from the entrance to the site. So whether or not the site is open to foot traffic, I encourage you to go and take a look. And also keep in mind that during certain parts of the year, like the winter, the site might be more sensitive to overuse. So travel delicately around the vernal pools when wet and during lark nesting season, but do get out and bird watch and enjoy it.
Yeah, it's a fantastic spot to visit. Yeah, thanks so much, Amanda. If any other questions come in, we'll see if perhaps we have time to fit those in at the end. So next, I'm excited to welcome Bob Altman, who has worked as a contractor on several of the Council's Oak and Prairie projects. And for the last 30 years or so, Bob has provided leadership and project management on numerous bird and habitat conservation activities in the Pacific Northwest. And he's also worked with a number of international partners, such as in Mexico and Central America, that has been working on benefiting migratory birds. And over all these years, his focus areas have included prairie oak bird and habitat conservation, cavity nesting birds in ponderosa pine forests, flycatchers, and aerial insectivores. He's written management and conservation plans, developed population estimates and management objectives for land birds. And he's recently retired from the American Bird Conservancy and is now focusing his efforts on 2 imperiled bird subspecies in the Willamette Valley. One is the Oregon Vesper Sparrow, and of course, the other is the Streaked Horned Lark, which he's going to talk a bit about here in a moment. So he's also going to talk now about the importance of wet prairie habitat to streaked horned larks and other grassland birds, and what he's been seeing in the monitoring data over these last few years, and why projects like Coyote Creek South give hope for the continued survival of rare species like the streaked horned lark. So Bob, I am going to share your presentation. Hi, Bob.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, that's the guy. Thanks, Rob, for that intro. And as I was listening to Amanda, it's interesting to me that, you know, I'm pretty embedded in this bird and its conservation for the last 10, 15 years, really. And sometimes when you're that close to it, you really need to step back a bit and realize how unique and interesting it is. Because as I was listening to Amanda, and I was trying to put myself in the place of someone from the general public who might not know much about this bird, and listening to some of the things Amanda was introducing about the habitat it likes, you'd say to yourself, really? This guy likes bare ground? Because that's not what we usually think about a lot of our bird species. We see them, you know, in the forests and in the residential areas, in the trees and such, but it really struck me as to how unique it is. So hopefully I can depart some interesting information for folks tonight and give you a sense of where we stand with this bird, how it fits in with prairies and especially wet prairie restoration, and then sort of just a sense of its uniqueness and its value. So next slide. So what is a streaked horned lark? Well, I have a friend who calls them streakers. And so every time I see him, he constantly says, hey, how are those streakers doing? And if nothing else, you know, that's one way of sort of thinking of this bird and remembering it, sort of a reference point to remember it, because it's a very local bird. It's a bird that's just found in Western Oregon and Western Washington. Historically, it occurred from southwestern British Columbia down to the California border, basically, but always west of the Oregon Cascades. So that's how it became isolated and became a subspecies. It was not connected to any other of the horned larks that are throughout North America. Horned lark is really a widespread bird throughout the continent of North America and actually even into Europe. There's probably about 12 different subspecies, depending upon who you talk to. So streaked horned lark is ours. It's the one that occurs west of the Cascades and in very sort of a limited distribution. You know, like a lot of bird species, like a lot of wildlife species, we don't really know exactly how many there were back in, you know, the 1800s and early 1900s. But the anecdotal record from what we have been able to glean from a lot of the early ornithologists indicate that it was a fairly common bird in suitable habitat where you would find it. It was fairly common. But what we're down to now, as Amanda indicated, basically less than 2,000 birds. And why? It's, you know, it's a familiar story, and Amanda alluded to this with wet prairie habitat. Much of Western Oregon and Western Washington has been impacted by the human footprint. And so that's resulted in significant changes to many habitats, and of course, many of the wildlife that live in those habitats. So streaked horned lark certainly is one of those. But one of the factors that I'll key in on in terms of habitat loss, and one of the reasons why we've seen this decline. Move back a little. I'm sorry, Clint. One of the reasons why is the change in the hydrology in terms of mostly the damming of the Willamette River and all of the tributaries. Was a vast floodplain in the Willamette Valley prior to damming, and that floodplain played a big role in creating streaked horned lark habitat. It has been listed under the Federal Endangered Species Act as a threatened species in 2013. Okay. This just gives you two images of the historic distribution on the left. You can see the yellow area. That's basically where it occurred historically. Look to the right. That's in the yellow again is the current distribution. It's primarily the Willamette Valley where most of the birds are, and then some sites up in the South Puget Sound, a few places along the Southwest Washington coast, and then some islands in the Columbia River. But that's all we have left. Next slide. A little bit about the bird's ecology. If it's basically sparrow size, it's a little bigger than most sparrows. Males look very different from females. That's a female in the lower left-hand corner and a male in the upper right. You can see the difference in plumage. The male is much more striking in terms of the black mask and the black bib. The yellow is brighter. There's sort of a chestnut colored shoulders and nape. And then there is this sort of characteristic little tufts of feathers on its head, which is where the bird gets its name, the horned lark. They nest on the ground. The breeding season is generally the 1st of May through July. They'll usually have 2 to 3 clutches a year, and oftentimes 3 to 4 eggs per clutch. And our birds here in the Willamette Valley are residents, so they don't migrate. They will move around in the winter to seek out resources, and they flock in the winter. So if you find them, they're usually going to be in a flock. Sometimes a small flock, sometimes pretty good sized flocks of 30, 40, 50 birds. Just depends. But they are resident, they don't migrate. Habitat. They just like the wide open spaces. Give them large open landscapes. They really don't like trees and shrubs at all. They want the vegetation to be short and fairly sparse. And as Amanda indicated, a pretty good percent of the area they like to be non-vegetated or bare ground. Next. This is just a photo out of Coyote Creek to show you what is pretty much ideal habitat. As you can see, wide open, no trees, sparsely vegetated, and short. That's kind of the classic for a lark, a streaked horned lark. Next. I want to show you some other slides or some other photos of habitat just to give you a more complete sense. This I put in here just because of the landscape. Think that's just a huge open landscape, which is what they prefer. So it meets the landscape criteria, but once you meet the landscape criteria, then you need to try to meet the other criteria that I talked about, the more local areas where it's sparsely vegetated, short statured grasses and forbs, and in this case, an actual vernal pool, as Amanda was talking about earlier. Next. Another example of a vernal pool. Now these vernal pools, we're going to talk about the creation of vernal pools, as Amanda brought up earlier, but they also occur naturally. There's a lot of places in fields in the Willamette Valley that are just depressions in the field, and those areas get flooded in the winter and early spring, and as they recede, they create, as the water recedes, it creates conditions like this, and highly suitable for the larks. Next. Zooming in a little bit, within one of those vernal pools, what you see in the previous slide, you saw a fair amount of bare ground, but over the course of the growing season, of course, in many cases that will fill in. And this is one that's sort of partially filled in, still providing the great conditions for the lark, but sort of moving in towards a little more vegetated state. Go ahead, next. And here's another example of good quality lark habitat, and this is also in an area near Coyote South in the West Eugene wetlands, but this is a wet prairie there, and again, you can see the conditions that larks like. There's a lot of what we refer to as interstitial spaces, spaces between clumps of forbs and grasses that are mostly bearish, but yet the vegetation is still very short and highly suitable for larks. Next. Now we're getting into a little bit of different situation, still very good habitat for larks, but this is an example of a ryegrass field similar to Coyote Creek South. This is a ryegrass field somewhere else that is being converted over into wet prairie. And this is after the first, maybe, I don't know, the first or second spraying, but you still see a lot of the old ryegrass in there, but you see areas that from a previous spray out were knocked back, so that you got this mix of, you know, some sparsely vegetated areas, some denser vegetated areas that actually can provide a little bit of hiding cover for birds. So that can work really well for larks too. Next. However, the challenge is a lot of these vernal pools and or swales, or sometimes we refer to them as drown out areas, they can vegetate up and become pretty dense, sometimes pretty quickly. Sometimes it may take the course of a growing season. It just really depends upon the site and what is in the seed bank. And this is an example of one that's actually gone out of suitability for larks. It probably was in suitability for a short period of time, maybe in the early spring, but I remember this site really vegetated up pretty quickly, and it got to be almost mat-like in there. So it went out of suitability for as far as larks are concerned. Next. Okay, so we've talked about wet prairie habitats, and that's our focus tonight, and that's what I'll get back to. But I wanted to give you a sense of the other areas where we find larks from a conservation standpoint. And the reality is they actually occur more in these other types of areas than they do in wet prairies, certainly partially due to the fact that we have so few wet prairies left. But they tend to like sites that are managed for other purposes. And as you can imagine, that creates areas of conflict. Upper left corner is Corvallis Airport. They love airports, obviously wide open landscapes. They keep the grasses down low, and there's oftentimes a lot of bare areas. But of course, there's planes going in and out. And actually, surprisingly, you might not think this, but larks are the #1 bird that are killed by airplanes at airports across the country. First of all, obviously, they like airports for the conditions they provide, but they're small birds. They don't impact airplanes that much in terms of danger, but they are frequently killed by airplanes. Upper right, you see it as she's pointing to a nest there right in the side of the road. Not uncommon. In fact, if that was a farm road and there was a sort of a gravel strip or a dirt strip or a grassy strip in the middle of the road, sometimes they'll even nest in the middle of the roads on farm roads. So clearly that raises potential problems. The lower right is one you might not even expect, but that's a Christmas tree farm, which we have a lot of in the Willamette Valley. And they actually like that 1 to 3 years when the seedlings are really small and it's just been planted and there's still a fair amount of bare ground. We find some pretty good populations in those places, but of course, they're subject to management. Spraying is done frequently in those places throughout the breeding season. And then lower left is the more traditional ryegrass field with a swale in the middle that's was underwater for a while, and now it provides good habitat for larks in the middle there. But of course, that field is going to get mowed, it's going to get harvested, it's going to get sprayed. So there's just going to be a lot of management activities going on, which could potentially negatively impact the birds. So there's a lot of challenges associated with trying to conserve this bird. Next. However, we're going to get back to the prairies again, and the wet prairies in Coyote South. And I've just got a couple pictures here of that before and after. I think you saw something similar in Amanda's presentation. And you can see the difference, incredible difference. and the suitability in the lower right of the early stages of prairie restoration is high for larks. But the challenge here is always, how do you maintain that suitability? How do you manage to inhibit plant growth to some degree such that it still provides the conditions that larks like? Through some disturbance activity, or some other activity, the challenge is to keep at least part of a site in that kind of condition. Next. And there are a few ways to do that. The two basic ones are the idea of creation of vernal pools, and this again is Coyote South up here on the upper left. And those vernal pools and any other low-lying areas, of course, get flooded, and they're underwater for a good part of the winter and spring. And that water then becomes your mechanism for inhibiting plant vegetation growth. And so when that water recedes, of course, that's when it becomes suitable for larks. And depending upon the site, you know, how long will that suitability be maintained is always the question. Next slide. There are a couple other ways that you can create lark habitat in wet prairies. In the upper right, you know, spot spraying of weeds is a critical part of prairie restoration, wet prairie restoration in particular. And so there's frequently in the early years of the prairie restoration, you've got to get people out there knocking down the weeds that are coming in or any of the old residual vegetation that you don't want. And so those spot sprayed areas become just little microclimates or micro habitats that larks can use because they're going to have very limited vegetation in them, even though there might be a fair amount of vegetation around them. And then Amanda mentioned the city of Eugene's Coyote Prairie site just next door to Coyote Creek South. And they are they're trying an innovative approach where they're putting in little gravel pads. You can see the vernal pools that are in water there to the right and in the background. But they put a gravel pad in there. And again, the idea is to some degree inhibit plant growth. Over time, that will start to fill in as sedimentation occurs, but at least with that gravelly base, over the years, you would hope that plant growth is not going to be as vigorous, and it might provide sites for larks to nest in. Next slide. So these vernal pools and swales or drowned out areas, whatever you want to call them, there's oftentimes, as I mentioned before, a progression. Look, starting upper left, sometimes the progression of vegetation grow in might look like upper left, upper right, lower left, lower right. But in some conditions, in some situations, you can maintain any one of those conditions for the entire growing season. It just depends on the site. And as I said, what's in the seed bank, what gets deposited in terms of seeds from winter flooding, those kind of things. But we have examples of both, places where vernal pools will maintain themselves like one of the upper conditions for the entire breeding season, and then others where they get more vegetated. When it gets down to the vegetation in the lower right, really good prairie start to get into real prairie conditions. That usually is when it's not suitable for larks. The vegetation gets taller and denser, and it loses suitability for larks. Next slide. However, that's good for a couple other birds that we're also very concerned about, which is western meadowlarks in the lower right and grasshopper sparrows in the upper left. Now, these are two other bird species that are of high conservation concern in the Willamette Valley. They're not federally listed like the lark, but we tend to treat them very similarly in terms of trying to work with partners on their conservation. Meadowlarks do not yet nest at Coyote Creek South. I think they will in the near future because they nest next door at Coyote Prairie. They do come over into Coyote South to forage though. And I think now that the prairie is itself in Coyote Creek South, at least phase one, is becoming a denser, taller prairie, I think meadowlarks will move in there. Grasshopper sparrows actually already decided they like it. So they moved in big time a little bit at the end of 2019, but in 2020, there were at one time 10 to 12 singing males out there. So quite a few birds were undoubtedly nesting, and they were there the whole breeding season. So I think they've moved in and will likely be a regular resident there every year. Next slide. So what about larks down at Coyote Creek South? And you've seen this, I think, in some of Amanda's maps in general, but you can see Coyote Creek South there is down in the lower left-hand corner, basically. And I've got two arrows. Amanda focused on the arrow in the upper arrow, which is called phase 1. But the arrow pointing down is phase 2 and phase 3, which I'll talk about in a minute, because we're also doing lark work down there as that prairie restoration is just getting going. But my point here is to show you that this is a wide open land, a large landscape. I'm guessing a couple thousand acres maybe, that is really open, and probably was like that historically, certainly. And so larks have likely been in this general area for a long time. We don't know. But certainly in the last 10 years, there's been a small population up to the north there where there's private property. It's an agricultural field where I have recent population. There's an agricultural field there. And you can see there's actually some swales running through there. And there's just some areas that are not productive from a grass growing standpoint, but flood out in the winter. And we've had larks up there for at least 10 years. My assumption is that the larks that we're now seeing in Coyote Creek South probably came from that population up there, or perhaps from Fern Ridge Wildlife Area, which also has some larks. Important thing to note here in general, this is the southernmost known population of streaked horned lark within their range. So it's significant at that level too. Next. Okay, a little bit of numbers and a little bit of a timeline here. I started actually doing surveys out there in 2014. Now that was actually not related to the project we're talking about. It was a different project. And at the time in 2014, that was still a grass field, and also in 2015. But we've done general bird surveys out there pretty much every year through 2020. We really started to survey for larks in 2017, which is Amanda showed in her timetable there. That's really when the restoration kicked in. And then we upped our game in 2019 to start not only just surveying for larks, trying to count them, but also trying to find their nests. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes, but we've been doing that for the last couple years. So what are the numbers we've seen out there? Well, back when it was an ag field, of course, 2014, 2015, we really didn't see larks. Now I have a star there in 2015. That indicates that actually there was one detection in March of 2015, which is prior to the breeding season. So they did not breed there that year, but we did have a detection while it was still an ag field. But look at 2017. As soon as it opened up for restoration and a lot of that sparsely vegetated bare ground was created, they just jumped in there, 4 to 5 pairs right off the bat. Same thing the following years in 2018. Now in 2019 to 2020, you see in phase 1, which is that the northern part of Coyote Creek South, the numbers have dropped, but we've started monitoring in phase 2, which is just in the more beginning part of the restoration, and you're seeing numbers of a couple, 2 to 3 pairs down there. So the reality is it's been pretty much the same population for the last 4 years. They've just shifted a little bit. And that makes perfect sense in terms of what we know about prairie restoration and lark occupancy. They come in early as the place slowly gets vegetated up over the first few years. The vernal pools become the key place for the larks. The rest of the prairie is functioning for a lot of other ecological values. So it's a very predictable pattern, but pretty much the same population for the last 4 years, just a little bit of shifting as to where they are. Next slide. The nest monitoring, why are we doing that? Well, it's really critical because what it does is it provides real-time information that the land managers can use to assist in lark conservation. So we're out there trying to find nests, and as soon as we find them, we let the land managers know, because there's a lot of other activities going on out in these fields. There's other monitoring going on. There's the need for spraying. Sometimes at the end of the season, there's a need for mowing. So if we can find nests, we can let people know where they are, buffer them so that they can be avoided. We're contributing to at least the potential for successful nesting, as opposed to if we just didn't do that, you don't know what might happen with some of those activities. So that's the real purpose and value of what we're doing in terms of nest monitoring. Next slide. I just want to show you a couple nests so you get a sense. The last slide showed you that, that they usually tuck their nest underneath overhanging vegetation. This one, as you can see there, is it's in the center of the picture, in the center, but it's under sort of under overhanging forb, pretty tall forb. Yeah, right in there. Next slide. However, they don't always do that. Sometimes they'll put them right out in the open. Now there's very little vegetation around there. And actually, if you zoomed out, there's almost no vegetation, no live vegetation. But they found a little dirt clod there that functions the same way as a little bit of an overhang to protect the nest. So we'll see them like that in those situations. Next slide. This is actually at Coyote Creek South in the phase 2 area. The nest is sort of in the crotch of those two dead stalks that are coming to a little point there. It's right in there. Again, wide open, mostly dead vegetation around there, but these are one of the types of situations they will nest in. Next slide. What are we finding in terms of the nest? Well, this is a small population, as I said, 4 to 5 pairs of birds. So you're not gonna expect to find too many nests. Nests aren't easy to find, despite when you look at those photos, you might say, oh, that's right out in the open. How could you miss that? Well, it's not that easy. But we have found 5 nests over the last 2 years. 4 of them have been successful. I estimate that there's probably been 2 or 3 times that many nests out there. I mean, we don't find them all, certainly. And you can see we've been finding them in the phase 1 area, which is that northern area. And then we found some in the phase 2, which is the more recent prairie restoration into the south. And you can see the cute little fuzzballs begging for food there. Next slide. We color band the nestlings. Each as an individual unique combination of color bands. We've banded 14 nestlings. We actually did catch one adult female, and banded her also. You can see her there in the lower right. We've only had one fledgling recite of the 14 that we've banded, although I suspect there's more. We don't put that much time out there. Other studies from Streaked Horned Lark elsewhere in their range have shown that, you're going to find usually 30 to 40% of them. You get recites on 30 to 40% of them. So I think that's probably the case here. We just haven't, we've only seen one. Next slide. So once they come out of the nest, they're in the nest for about 9 or 10 days. When they come out, they can't fly. In fact, they don't really fly well for 2 weeks. So there's this period of time when you come out of the nest that you're flightless and very vulnerable. So the answer to that, of course, is you better be cryptic and be able to camouflage. And this is a great shot showing a youngster here that just blends right in. Instead of where's Waldo, it's where's the lark here. Just fitting right in with the background there. Next slide. Same thing here. Still got a lot of downy feathers on it. This bird probably might be able to fly a short distance, but not likely very far. It's still in that stage, but pretty well hidden. Next slide. So even when they get older, and here this guy's lost most of its downy feathers, it's starting to look like an adult bird there, but the browns blend in well with the dead vegetation there and helps to camouflage it. This bird could probably fly a little bit, I would guess, at this stage. Not long distances, but short distances. Next slide. And I wanted to throw one more in just because you can never have too many baby bird pictures. And this guy is out in the gravel on the rock, but still, I mean, from above, there's likely, if you're looking down from above as an aerial predator would, there's likely to be a pretty good blending in with the rock and the dirt and the sand there. And next slide. Okay, I just wanted to end with some final thoughts about larks in wet prairies in general, and certainly more specifically Coyote Creek South. The key with these prairie restorations, as we've seen at Coyote Creek South, is the creation of vernal pools and the ability for those vernal pools to maintain some level of inhibited plant growth throughout the course of the growing season. And that's always the challenge that we face. And the birds at Coyote Creek South, I think, have followed a predictable pattern. Big numbers right off the bat when you start the prairie restoration. Those numbers drop a little bit as the prairie starts to mature. And I think there'll probably be, overall, once the prairie restoration is done, probably 2 to 4 pairs out there between Coyote Creek South Phase 1 and then the 2 other phases to the south also. Right now, probably Phase 1 is past its prime, those big numbers we know. Now it's just down to the vernal pool habitat. Phase 2 is probably in about the same situation, but Phase 3, which is really in the beginning stages, will probably actually have more birds there next year than it has to this point. So the other thing I think that will occur here in terms of larks and their population at Coyote Creek South is we'll probably see some movement in the next couple of years as the one new prairie restoration that's coming on in the next couple of years, I think, which is just catty corner to Coyote Creek South. Once that one gets into its early phases of restoration, we'll probably see some bird movement into there. So it's going to be a fluctuating population down there, but I think in general there's the potential for a couple pairs, but they may move around from year to year in terms of what else is available in the landscape. So that's all I have to present, and I can answer any questions if there are any.
Thanks, Bob. Super cool to hear about such an interesting bird and how it's adapted to wet prairie and vernal pool habitats. Couple questions that came in. So you mentioned how they're at the southern edge of, or we're at the southern edge of the lark's range. How does climate change affect that? And would we start seeing, as the climate warms, birds moving further south potentially, or could that start forcing them further north?
Yeah, that's a good question. And there actually has been some modeling done that would show a variety of bird species and how their ranges will change in the in the Northwest. And the challenge is that with it's much easier to predict with birds that have larger populations and are doing well and have, quote, surplus birds to populate new areas. The challenge with an endangered species, or a lark specifically, is that you have a declining population. So even though habitat may move and shift, if you don't have birds to make that move and shift, it's a bit of an unknown. So the greater concern right now is to get the population back up to some numbers where it has the potential ability to take advantage of any shifts in habitat by having surplus birds. Mm-hmm. The other challenge, of course, is we're at the southern end of the Willamette Valley. They're a resident bird. They have no migratory instinct. So there's no real internal reason to leave where they are unless there is simply no habitat where they are. As long as there's habitat where they are, they'll probably stay where they are. So the population itself would have to get really large and dense such that birds can't find places, and then they start to move. So that's the other challenge with the resident bird, is to try and will it move if climate change affects its habitat availability elsewhere in its range. Bit of an unknown, but I think it's probably a long shot in terms of them just moving south, for instance, if climate change improved habitat conditions down there. Of course, they used to nest in the Rogue and the Umpqua valleys to the south, but there's none there now.
Yeah, so given all that and just how rare wet prairie habitat is itself, and it seems like these birds need a lot of acreage, what can the average citizen in the community do that might have land or Christmas tree farms or these agricultural fields that you mentioned? What could they do to help support lark habitat?
I think the best thing, and I mentioned in that one slide, that larks like to, we're challenged by the fact that they like to use sites that are managed for other purposes. They tend to put themselves in harm's way. So for an individual that has land that they are managing and it meets the criteria for lark habitat in terms of the open landscape and the potential for site conditions to be suitable for larks, or if it's a situation where you are, it's a working lands and you are managing it for some other value, I think the main thing is to be able to try and understand if larks are occurring there. If they are occurring there, what types of things can you do within the realm of what your management practices are, or your within your working landscape? What types of things you can do to minimize the impact that you might have on them during the nesting season? Because that's, I think, where our biggest challenge is we can address wet prairies and suitable habitat on conservation lands, but outside of conservation lands, it's really up to the local landowner to be engaged in the activities that will support larks and integrate that into their land management. So yeah, it's a challenge.
Yeah, and what about someone who might live in town or Eugene or another community nearby that doesn't own land and cares about larks? What is something that they could do?
Support your local conservation organizations. Support the Long Tom Watershed Council. I mean, really, it gets down to that. I'm obviously playing a little bit here, but when you're in a situation you don't have direct ability to affect those kind of this bird like this, it's really supporting the organizations who can and do that stuff. And obviously, as we know, there's many ways to do that. It's not necessarily just financial. Well, that's certainly one component of it, but there's other ways to get engaged and be it outreach, education, whatever. Support those entities that do these kinds of, that have the ability to do these kinds of things.
Well, it looks like we're at time. Bob and Amanda, thanks so much to both of you. Really appreciate each of you for sharing your expertise and knowledge and helping to bring LTWC's work a little closer to all of the community, even though we can't gather together right now. I also want to thank everyone who turned in to LarkTV in our very first attempt at live streaming. We are going to post this link to the video for people to watch later here on our YouTube channel and also on our website. I also do want to remind people that you can explore the story map that Amanda was walking through at the beginning at our website, longtom.org/Coyote Creek South. And as has been mentioned in the comments page of YouTube, there is an evaluation form of our first live stream event that we have also posted to our webpage. And we encourage you to check that out and give us feedback and help us grow and learn on how to continue to bring these sorts of virtual events to the public going forward. Lastly, we do have an upcoming public meeting scheduled for Tuesday, September 22nd at 9 a.m. City of Eugene ecologist Lori Holtz will be leading a site tour at Golden Gardens Pond to talk about western pond turtles. Attendance will be limited to about 8 or 10 people. Masks and social distancing will be required, and we will be gathering RSVPs to make sure we keep that number down. And then, of course, we'll also be sharing a video that can be viewed afterward of the discussion and conversation that took place. So thanks again to everybody for checking this out, and hope you can check out the next one. Have a good evening, be safe, and be well.
Thank you.